Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're jumping right into an impartial comparative dive into the absolute oldest story known to humanity. We're going to look at the familiar biblical narrative of creation side by side with the lesser-known text of the Quran. Now, whether you've been studying these texts for years or you're just curious about ancient history, putting these source documents next to each other reveals some completely fascinating and honestly surprising distinctions about how different traditions view human nature itself. So, let's kick things off by challenging a pretty common baseline assumption. If I were to walk up to almost anyone in the Western world right now and ask, where did Eve come from? You would almost definitely give me the exact same universally recognized answer. But as we dig into our source material today, we actually find that this widely accepted origin story, well, it isn't shared across all major historical texts. Which brings us to Section 1, the creation misconception, one soul versus the rib. To really grasp this divergence, we've got to look at the texts side by side. The biblical account from Genesis chapter 2, as most of us know, describes the creation of woman from the rib of man. Eve comes from Adam. But the story told in the Quran is structurally completely different. According to chapter 4, male and female were created simultaneously from one single soul. Neither gender preceded the other in the creation timeline. We can see this directly in the Quranic source material. The text literally says, "He is the one who created you from one soul, and he made from it its mate to reside with." So the absolute crucial point here is that the Quran establishes a single, unified origin point for both male and female. There's no physical deriving of one gender from the physical body of the other. Instead, they both stem from this singular starting point. All right, moving right along to Section 2, an evolutionary creation process, phase development in the text. Now, across multiple verses in the Quran, the creation of mankind actually isn't described as a single, instantaneous event. It's not just a sudden snap of the fingers. It outlines a sequence of events that almost resembles an evolutionary process. Step 1, God initiates the creation. Step 2, this long sequence of physical development unfolds, sustained by the Creator. And then finally, Step 3, mankind is given its unique human qualities. All right. Moving our timeline forward, we arrive at Section 3, blame for the downfall. This brings up a critical question that has historically shaped gender dynamics and theological doctrines for millennia. Who is actually to blame for the downfall of mankind? And once again, when we hold these foundational texts up to the light side by side, the answers they provide differ significantly from one another. We can see a remarkably clear impartial contrast here. The biblical texts referencing Genesis, 1 Timothy, and 2 Corinthians explicitly state that Eve was deceived and sinned first, so it places the initial blame on the woman. In stark contrast, the Quranic account of Adam and mankind in chapter 7 explicitly assigns equal blame for their downfall to both of them. There's no individual singling out of the woman as the primary culprit. Let's look at the aftermath in Section 4, the burden of sin. To really understand this next major textual difference, we first need to define the theological concept known as original sin. Basically, original sin is a concept suggesting that humans are inherently born already carrying the burden and guilt of that very first transgression committed by the first humans. It's the idea that a flawed, sinful nature is quite literally inherited at birth. So the crucial point here is how the differing texts handle this inherited guilt. The Quran actually addresses this directly. The text reads, "No bearer of burdens shall be made to bear another's burden." As our source notes, this phrase is repeated across multiple chapters. This text vehemently rejects the concept of original sin. Instead, it establishes a framework where every single person is born sinless, carrying a mandate of strict individual accountability. Simply put, you are only responsible for your own actions, not the actions of your ancient ancestors. And that leads us perfectly into Section 5, humanity's default setting. Think about it. Logically, if humans aren't born sinful, if we aren't born with a corrupted nature, then what exactly are we born with? Well, the Quranic text outlines a specific default setting for humanity. It describes a natural, built-in inclination within people away from falsehood and pointed directly towards the truth and what is right. Chapter 30, verse 30 brilliantly illustrates this concept. It says, "So set your face or consideration for the obligation of uprightness. The nature that God created mankind on, there is no changing in the creation of God. That is the correct obligation, but most of the people do not know." The source text notes that the basic meaning of the word used for uprightness here is quite literally to incline away from falsehood toward that which is true. It's a really fascinating passage because it asserts this inherently upright nature as an unchangeable fact of human biology and spirituality. But it also notes with a bit of irony at the end that despite this default setting, most people simply don't realize it. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We've seen how differently these ancient texts handle the mechanics of creation, the assignment of blame, and the concept of inherited guilt. But think specifically about that last point. How would viewing human nature as inherently upright and naturally inclined toward truth, rather than viewing it as inherently flawed and born into sin, change how we see each other today? It's a striking reminder of the immense power our foundational narratives have on shaping our modern worldview. Thanks for following along with these textual comparisons, and as always, keep questioning the source material.